Welcome, everybody. This is Gaming Gaiden, the podcast that uncovers the side stories of the gaming world as well as the world of Japanese localization. I am Andrew, and right here with me is Mike.
Hey, everybody.
And this episode is actually going to be less about the gaming side and more about the Japanese to English localization, as our guest is Zack Davisson.
Hello.
Woo!
Thank you for coming on, Zack. Zack Davisson is a modern-day Lafcadio Hearn is picking up this ghostly torch. Zack Davisson is the author, translator, and folklorist following in Hearn's footsteps. That's from tofugu.com. He is an award-winning translator, writer, lecturer, and scholar of manga and Japanese folklore and ghosts. He's the author of Yurei, the Japanese Ghost, Yokai Stories, Narrow Road, and Kaibyo, the Supernatural Cats of Japan, from Chin Music Press. He is a professional translator and the author of Confessions of a Manga Translator, was nominated for the 2014 Japanese-U.S. Friendship Commission Translation Prize, and the translator of the Eisner Award-winning and Harvey Award-nominated Shigeru Mizuki's Showa, A History of Japan. And you're also very well known for Gegege no Kitaro's translation into English.
Yep.
It's a very lengthy resume.
I was going to say, that's an old bio. I need to update that one a little bit, too.
I figured if I got it from your site, it was safe to use.
Yeah. That's a reminder that I need to update my own site. So, yeah, that's good.
I actually added a couple of things in there.
Yeah.
Oh, did you? Okay, good. Yeah, good. All right, Mike, let's get the interview kicked off here.
All right. So, just to let you know, I came across your work via Wayward. I started reading that comic and I saw the essays in the back. And it's funny because initially I was thinking, I'm going to just wait for the next issue. But, I was reading that one monthly and I came across the essay and I thought, why not? Let's give it a go. And I read the essay and it ended up being one of the things that I really looked forward to with each issue of that. And that's what introduced me to your work and is the main reason that I knew of you and decided to ask you to be the first guest for us. So
awesome. Well, thanks. I really appreciate that. Yeah, Wayward was really, in many ways, it was the start of my career, especially into American comics, and just like a real transition point. And I think it represents a lot of what I like to do. Like I always laugh at Tofu calls me like the modern day Lafcadio Hearn, because that was in a way it was my goal. My goal was always to be not just like Hearn, but like a lot of folks, to be a writer translator. I never wanted to be just a translator. I never wanted to be just a writer. And so when I first started out, that was my plan. And also just to translate works that I was really proud of, rather than just being what I would consider to be like a line translator that gets stuff assigned to them, by an editor, and they may not be passionate about it, they may not care. It was just, that was not really the career I wanted to have. So yeah, and Wayward played a big part in that. Now I work on Demon Days from Marvel Comics with my friend Peach Momoko, and I've had a pretty broad spread as both a translator and writer.
So yeah, would you care to go right into that? Demon
Sure.
Days, X-Men, that is a bit of a unique creative process from what I understand. Could you describe that process? Because I think you ran into some trouble making it clear what your role was in it and everything.
Yeah, it's an interesting process. It's also very traditional in a way when you think about it from how Marvel Comics writes comics. So back when Stan Lee was writing comics, he developed what he called the Marvel method, which is that basically the artist would do all of the work, and then Stan Lee would come in and fill in the dialogue balloons and take all the credit. And so what Pete and I do is not exactly Marvel method, but Marvel method is the closest thing that you'll get to it. Peach does the plots, and she will basically do a rough guide of the rough draft of the story and then send it to me. And then what I will do is I'll dialogue it, because Peach, when we first started, and Peach and I have been friends for a long, long time. We've been trying to do a comic together for many years now, actually. So it's kind of interesting that our first one we managed to do together was from Marvel. But yeah, I'll just go through and dialogue the thing, and then Peach and I will do like a nice consultation back and forth. We'll either meet on Zoom and talk it over, or we'll just send notes back and forth until that's how we finally get the finished comic. And it confused a lot of people because they assumed I was translating it. And I thought it was really funny because I actually read one review where they said it was not as good as the Japanese original, which cracked me up because there is no Japanese original. It's literally Yeah, it's literally blank pages that I get sent that are dialogue free, and Peach might have like a little notes about what she thought characters are thinking, or what she wanted them to portray here. But yeah, the dialogue is all the original language is English. There is no Japanese.
Yeah.
There is no translation done in Demon Days.
Wow.
Oh wow, that's interesting. I was
Yeah.
reading the first part of it this morning. Actually, it's awesome, man. I
thanks.
was actually unaware of it until recently, but I mean, you got Venom in there as a Orochi or something, and like there's I can't spoil too much. I didn't get too far, but there's a line where it says Hulk Maru smash.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They turn Hulk into a demon in it. Everybody, it's awesome.
That's also, I mean, one of the things that I really do when I supply this is I supply the sort of Marvel part of it. Because I have been reading comics since I was, seems like since I was born. There's never been a part of my life where I wasn't reading comics, and so I have this encyclopedic background of Marvel comics, even more so than our editor. Like, there's been a few things I put in there, and our editor is like, what's this? I'm like, oh, this is a reference to this obscure comic back, blah blah blah. I know, because I just think it's fun to put those things in there. Like Peach didn't know that Nightcrawler goes bamf, and so I had to explain to her that was the sound effect, and it wasn't just a weird random noise I decided to put in there. And I'm like, trust me, when this character goes bamf, everyone will instantly know that that's our version of Nightcrawler. And it's also been, I mean, C.B. Cebulski has been essentially, without his support, then Demon Days would not exist, because he really took Peach and, took me and like sort of handpicked us both to work on the series. And also just like allowed us this playground, this non-continuity playground to play in, which is really, really rare, to be honest. Most of the time when you do series, they have to be tied into continuity, or else readers won't buy them. And that's one of the sad parts of modern superhero comics, is like readers don't consider it real if it's not a continuity comic. They'll be like, oh, I'm not buying that. It doesn't count,
Right.
And by that, Demon Days does not count. But that's the best part, because we get to do anything we want in there. It's like, oh, we want to kill Sabretooth. They're like, fine. Kill Sabretooth,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
No, that's great. It's wonderful that they are willing to take a little risk here and there, because I've always wondered why the big two wouldn't be the ones to say, like, we have the greatest resources and options to be able to do this. Let's just explore.
I mean, factually, the answer to that is it's not them, it's the readers. The big two will try to do it all the time, but if the readers don't support it, the readers don't buy it, then that's it. That's as far as it goes, So you'll find, I mean, the companies themselves would love to do more, but the readers need to show up, and that's just how it works in these things. Ultimately, the readers dictate what kind of comics they get, because every time they buy a comic, what they're doing is they're voting for more of this, And every time they don't buy a new comic that's maybe experimental or a little different or trying something new, that's basically just telling the companies, we don't want this, sadly. But that's also, it's a business. Comics is a business.
Yeah.
It's an art form, but it's also, at the end of the day, it's a business, and those decisions have to be made. But once again, unfortunately, Demon Days, I think, has been a bit of an anomaly, and we've been allowed to do whatever we want with it, and readers have bought it and have supported it, which has just been amazing, because you have no idea. I mean, when you do a series like this, I mean, I remember that even with Wayward, and, when you publish the first issue, there's always just this absolute fear that it is going to bomb, that it's just going to absolutely and completely bomb. And I'm not going to name names, because that would be wrong of me, but I've worked on series that bombed, just completely bombed, that I thought was amazing and spectacular, and I thought was just some of the best work I've ever done and amazing. It just, for whatever reason, didn't connect with readers. There's no real telling until you put it out there what the reaction is going to be.
I know exactly what you mean. There's been a few things that I've made, either film-wise or podcast-wise or whatever, and I'll love it, but then it won't get any reception, and it makes me feel like, is what I like too niche? Am I just too niche? Because I really genuinely love this, I think. And
we ask this question on a podcast focused on localization of video games.
Localization gaming, I know, right?
I know, this is another niche thing, but I think there's an audience, though. I see this audience on Twitter, though. This is part of what gave me the idea to start a podcast like this, is because this whole, I mean, you're older than us, Zach, I think, but I mean, even when I started studying Japanese in earnest, when I finally moved to Japan in 2006, I was only there for 3 years. I moved back in '09,
Mm-hmm.
but it didn't feel like there was that much of a world of Japanese learners.
Oh God, no. Yeah.
But now it feels like there's such a community of Japanese learners online. It's so crazy. I wish I had that back then, but I still did okay, I guess. But
yeah, and I mean, and that's one of those things. I mean, I don't know how deeply or how sudden we want to jump into that particular end of the swampy pool, but I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I first started learning Japanese, I mean, it was, I'm just going to go ahead and date myself here. So, because there's no ways to do it. When I started learning Japanese back in 1983, there were not a lot of resources at all. I mean, there were nothing. There was no resource. Hell, the internet didn't exist. So, it is what it is. But, nowadays there's so much and there's so much available. But conversely, that's created just like an entire generation of, Dunning-Kruger effect people, learners who have learned maybe 10 lessons on Duolingo, and now they all of a sudden think that they know what translation is all about and what localization is all about because they were, watching in their recent anime or something, something they like, and they heard a word, and then they looked and the subtitle didn't match the word, and they're like, well, I know this word means, door or whatever, but they didn't write that. They wrote petunia, so it must be wrong because they picked out this one word, and then they'll write, a 30-volume essay on whatever website they're on about how, how this localization is wrong and localization is off. I hope that you guys are forewarned that among a certain population of Twitter, I am the most hated man alive. There are literally websites, as I found out, devoted to hating me because people occasionally like copy paste these things, like tweets that I wrote like 6 years ago and like throw them at me. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's been a
totally
very
fine.
Strange thing to see, and I'm amazed by it. I feel like, generally speaking, if you have the level of knowledge where you can critique the translation, then why not enjoy it in its original language and let it be?
Absolutely,
it's simple.
Yeah. And most people aren't even doing that. Most people are just simply recycling someone else's opinion as well, because someone will go on one of these Discords and they'll post this one thing, and it's not like translators don't make mistakes. Of course we do. We're human, and we're dealing with millions of words, millions of words. So of course we're going to make mistake, and they feel like if they make one gotcha mistake, and it'll just get recycled infinitely by people who don't actually know why it's a mistake. They just save the image that someone else posted, and it's pretty strange, but it's also cool. I mean, like you said, there's so much more engagement, and also just seeing this explosion of this world of entertainment that I once was very small, and now seeing it just universally embraced. Frankly, I love it. I think it's so great, and it's created so much more opportunity for localizers as well, so much more jobs, so much more possibility. I love it. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you started in '83. You were studying. What is your path to Japan? What sparked your interest? What made you get started learning at that time?
I mean, the main thing for me is when I was about 8 years old, my mother took me to see the movie Seven Samurai, and which seems a very strange thing for a mother to do. Like, I think I'll take my 8-year-old son to like this 3.5-hour subtitled black and white movie, but that was just the kind of wacky chick my mom was. And she took me to see it, and it was really my first time ever experiencing a foreign language in any depth, right? I grew up in this small town called Spokane, Washington, not really well known for its internationalness, is a polite way of saying what Spokane is like. But it was my first time like immersed in a foreign language, like, over 3 hours of hearing this. And I was so fascinated, that this gobbledygook that was coming out of their mouth was somehow made sense, and I wondered so much what it must be like inside their heads. Like, I understood like their voice would come out, maybe, but what it was like to think in this language. And whatever it was, I came out of that movie a different person, and I was just like, one of these days I'm going to grow up and I'm going to be able to watch this movie, and I'm going to be able to think in my head and listen to it. And I just had this goal, and it was hard to do. I mean, I started in junior high school, but my class was canceled because only 2 people signed up for it because nobody cared about Japanese back then.
It's wild to think about now.
It is wild to think about now. And I did various things all my life, and I dabbled in it, stepped in and stepped out. But I also realized at one point in time that I was just not a self-studier. Like, I cannot read a book and learn how to do something. I'm like, if I'm ever going to learn Japanese, I have to go to Japan. That is literally the only way I'm going to do it. So I found the JET program and jumped on a plane. Never been to Japan before in my life. Zoom, come home close to a decade later, and that was my Japanese school. And it's also why I'm the worst person. People are like, what's your advice on learning Japanese? I'm like, okay, step one, move to Japan, live there for about a good 5 or 6 years, Like that's my step one. And not a lot of people want to do that step one, but it's really all I got.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned JET. Both Andrew and I were ALTs, assistant language teachers. For those who don't know, JET is the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. It's run through the Ministry of Education. I also started on that program. I went there in 2001. That was my first time on the JET program.
So we were the same. I also was 2001.
Hey, look at that.
Yeah.
Wow.
So you went in that summer, right? Because that's when they usually start.
Yep. Summer of 2001. Yep.
Oh man, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's funny. I graduated from college in 2001 and did a little work doing custodial stuff, picked up some cash, and then I was out. And I went there with 3 words, and that was that. Because there was no program in my college. I even tried at one point. They were like, we can study Chinese. And I was like, well, maybe I can get a jump start on this kanji. And they canceled that class because there weren't enough people.
Weren't enough people. Wasn't enough interest. Yep.
So, it was a different time.
It was.
I only knew like aisatsu, only the greetings when I moved there. And then I just really dove in and try to learn pretty quickly at that point, because I gets to a point where, on top of just A, wanting to learn in general, B, really hate not knowing what's going on around me. After a while, that started to really, really get to me. So that was a big motivator for, you know what I mean?
Well, and when you're there, and like I can't even say that I dove in right away, because I would say I spent about the first 2 years just fucking around, I mean, and I don't know if I can say that on your podcast or not.
You can.
But I mean, it's easy to be in Japan and not speak a word of Japanese, especially if you're near one of the major cities, right? And like I was near Osaka, in Kyoto, and it's so easy to I talk about a lot. It's so easy to be like a fish in a fishbowl, right? And carry your little pot of water around with you everywhere you go, and not really interact with Japan. And lots of people do that. I mean, I think most jets do that. Most jets come over, they do their stuff, they have their fun, they go home. But after about 2 years of just doing that, I was just like, you know what? I really want to break out of the fishbowl, and there's no way to do it, except for get out of that Japanese language, English language bubble,
Yeah, and it's not unique necessarily to the JET program. I've worked many years as an English as a second language educator, and it's something you commonly see with immigrant populations. If there's a good strong support network, then people will latch on to that support.
Yeah,
I mean, it's generally the path of least resistance. Let's be comfortable. Why not?
Totally. And there's a lot of people in Japan who want to keep you in that, because you're there to practice English. That's the whole reason the government brings you over there. You're not there to learn Japanese. You're there for other Japanese people to practice their English on. It's why, I mean, I don't know if things have changed much now, but like when I interviewed in the JET program, when we did back in 2001, if you were too fluent in Japanese, that was a mark against you, because Japan doesn't need to import Japanese speakers. They've got a whole country full of people fluent in Japanese. The last thing they need is to bring people over that are fluent in Japanese. So they actually were specifically looking for people who didn't speak Japanese, because they were then more likely to force Japanese people to speak in English and then practice their English, which was why the government was paying for us to be there. So
right. Yeah. I was told I was studying too much in the teacher's room when I was there. but again, I was just trying to understand what was going on around me.
Yep.
Yeah.
Did you have any
humbling experience?
Yes, definitely. Did you
but
have
transformative, and that's one other thing, especially for all of us on the JET program. Like a lot of people will have to say, like, "Oh, you're so lucky you got to do this," and I will just say, luck had nothing to do with it. It was the JET program. If you want to go, then go. That's all there is to it. If you've got a college degree, then go apply for JET and go have your own adventure. You can do it, and there's no roll of the dice. There's no luck involved. It's just a matter of doing it.
Yeah. And there are plenty of other programs too.
Oh, yeah.
I felt like I was one of the few that was rejected by JET. I applied went to some seminar in Tampa, Florida, because I'm from Atlanta. I had a friend who lived in Tampa, so I stayed at his place. Drove down there, did like this like day-long seminar and applied and everything, and they didn't accept me. And then I found gaijinpot.com.
Oh, nice.
And then I found a company called RCS, which is how I ended up in Saitama, and I met Mike in Saitama.
So to clarify that, I was there in 2001 on the jet, but I only did 1 year because they have they make you
that's right.
They make you choose whether or not to stay very early on. I think it was like in January or February, and 9/11 happened, and my family and everything. It was like, okay, I'm gonna go home.
That was a thing, man. Being in Japan during all of that. I mean, that was a thing. Wow.
I got interviewed by a newspaper, and I thought it was the guy who like worked at the city hall or whatever. And I was like, wait, which so and so is this?
I mean, it's also weird for me. I mean, I guess as an American, I missed all of that. Like, I skipped that entire period of American history. I viewed it from another country, which was a very strange experience.
Yeah. It was, I mean, I came back in 2002 and it was like, whoa, this is not what I left.
My biggest one was I missed Obama's election, I think.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
So
America felt different when you came back.
Of course it did.
Post-9/11.
Yeah, of course it did. I mean, but also I was there for so long that, there's no way, for it not to have felt differently. It was just strange coming back,
That's
I mean, now I've been back for long enough, but reverse culture shock is a real thing.
Very much so.
Yeah. But I was gonna say that's another great thing. It's like you're certainly not the only person rejected from Jet. I mean, Jet rejects far more people than they actually bring on. I mean, they bring on a couple thousand amongst tens of thousands of applicants. But even when you're not rejected, even if you are rejected from Jet, I know people that's where they stopped. They're like, oh, I got rejected from Jet. I guess I won't go to Japan. And
like there's only one option.
Yeah, it's not like there's only one option. I mean, then there's other ways to get there. There's like the old saying where there's a will, there's a way, and it's just a matter of finding that way. But the one way that does not exist is the path of luck. There's no like lottery or roll the dice or stand at the airport and hope that a free seat opens up. Like every way but luck is the way to get over there.
Zach, did you have anything what I like to call language shock when you first started learning Japanese? Because I know for me, well, I started learning a little bit when I was a kid, I guess, just like simple phrases. And one of the first things I remember was like, the verb's always at the end? This is crazy. Like, for some reason, that completely shocked me. I just, because my exposure to other languages was all just European languages. So, did you have any experience like that?
I mean, it's hard for me to remember exactly like language shocks per se. I think the biggest language shock is that like, I don't know, I'm going to draw a metaphor here, and it may be a terrible metaphor, but we'll see if it works and if it plays out the way I did. But if you ever played Final Fantasy 1, the video game,
probably the first one. I've played a lot of them.
Well, I know this happens in all of Final Fantasy, I think. But when I first played Final Fantasy 1, I played blah blah blah. I played it for a long time, and I cleared most of the map. And then I found the airship. And the airship, there's a scene where the airship goes out and the map expands, and you realize you've come nowhere near clearing the entire map. All you've done is clear this one little portion. And I felt like that translation when I moved off of Mas Des form. Like I was like Mas Des, I know it. And they're like, good, you've done very good. Now we'll teach you actual Japanese that people use. And it was like, what? Why did you waste my time teaching me all this language that no one actually uses? And then you go into like, the other, like the regular forms and they're like, oh yeah, that phrase that everyone learns first, watashi no namae wa Zack desu. No Japanese has ever said that in the history of Japan. Now let's teach you how you would actually introduce yourself, So I think that was my the whole politeness level, and like the fact that politeness level wasn't a matter of being nicer, that you literally use an entirely different language depending on politeness level was just like, and I'm still to this day, I'm horrible at Keigo. I just like I decided long ago that I was never going to master Keigo, and so instead I mastered the phrase of, I'm sorry, I'm a foreigner, I don't speak Keigo very well, please forgive me, and that usually gives you a free pass, so it's nice.
Yeah, that can be a little rough.
Definitely.
Can you tell us?
Definitely really complex. I can't.
And
deal
also,
with it.
like, I mean, like, and then, like, just learning the alphabet system and understanding, like, that Japanese has effectively 4 workable alphabets that they use, or not alphabets, but character sets, because there's
Yes.
kanji, and then there's, hiragana and katakana, obviously, and then there's romaji, which is used all
Yeah.
over Japan. And just the fact that it's written using the English alphabet does not mean it's not a different
Yeah.
character set, because what they're writing in Romaji is not the same thing that you would write in English. So they use these 4 different character sets, and it's just, yeah. I know Japanese is just terrible. It's a terrible language. It's so confusing. And as I often tell people who are like, "Oh, I'm just starting learning Japanese," I'm like, "Well, my condolences," because you and most people, it's most people start learning Japanese, and it's like this is another weird metaphor, but once again, hopefully it works. So I climbed Mount. Did you climb Mount Fuji when you were in Japan?
Yes.
I
Okay.
did not.
So I climbed Mount Fuji with a group of people, like a lot of people. I just kind of went on like a jet-sponsored tour, and we started at the foot of, Mount Fuji, or like whichever station is that you drive to. We started there, and we started with a group of probably like 40 people, right? And 2 of them dropped out right at the base. They literally
Oh,
showed up in
wow.
flip-flops and shorts, and they didn't realize, because they hear like 100-year-old people climb Mount Fuji. They thought it was going to be more of a stroll than a legitimate hike, right? And so when they actually saw what they'd signed up for, they just noped out. And at every station, more and more people noped out, right? So we started off with, like, I'd say about 40, and I'd say maybe 5 of us actually made it up. And learning Japanese is a lot the same way. People will get there because they think it might be fun. It might be fun to learn Japanese. Once they actually see what they're signing up for, most people are just going to nope out, and that's fine. They're not.
Yeah.
They don't have to. It's totally fine for you just to look at something and say, I don't feel like putting that much effort into this. And being able to say that to yourself and noping out. And I think that as you go along, more and more people will just nope out, and very few people will make it to the top.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite the mountain to climb there. I just actually, after many years, decided I would like to get familiar with, say, the Joyo kanji, and I decided to go ahead and do the Wanikani program, because I was like, look, they've done it for me. They've set it up. I just have to show up and press the buttons. And it's even doing that with it all laid out for me has been rough.
And I will say also, like, and that's even a bad metaphor, because with a mountain, you eventually get to the top. In Japanese, you don't.
That's true. That's true.
You really just, and that's the other thing.
That's
You're
true.
signing up for a lifelong of climbing, right?
Yeah.
Because there's so many kanji that I'll just look at and I'm like, I know I learned that once. I know I did, and I can't remember it. And then I'll look it up and I'm like, God damn, of course I knew that. But like someone else described this when I first started Japanese. Like, kanji is like a giant list of characters on a table, and every time you put one off, you push another one off the end. And so every time you learn a new kanji, you forget another one. But one of the things that made me feel comfortable with that was, so I'm married to my wife, and she's a Japanese person, and she doesn't know all the kanji. She'll often look at kanji. She'll be like, no idea. And I'm like, yeah, just like I don't know every word in English. And I certainly don't know how to spell every word in English, and I'll misuse words in English. And once you make that realization, it's like, even as a native speaker, I'm not a master of my own language. I don't feel as bad about not being a master of my second language.
Yeah, it's a very important thing for people to understand. And as a language educator, I really try to help my students recognize that, because they tend to think that the people around them or speaking to them are masters of the English language. And I'm like,
oh, yeah.
No, I have a master's in teaching it, and I'm not a master. You know how many times I've looked up the word secular?
Oh, yeah.
Every single time it comes up, I'm like, you know what? I know what this means, but I don't. I got to look it up again.
Yep. And we'll fight with each other over what certain words mean, and I mean, just and it's because language in a whole is a confusing mess, and especially when languages are as disparate as Japanese and English are. I think if you're learning more Romance languages, there's a lot more continuity there and a lot more in common. But I mean, Japanese and English are about as about as disparate as 2 languages on Earth can possibly be. I mean, I've often heard that the American military ranks languages by complexity, by a number. So basically, like 1, for example, is the easiest language. Like Spanish might be a 1. So that's the easiest language for a English speaker to learn. And when you're brought in
Mhm.
and they teach you a language in the military language schools, that's how they're ranked. And there are only two what they call level 5 languages on Earth, which are the most difficult. So the most difficult of all the languages, there's only two level 5, and those are Japanese and Arabic. And of those
Mm-hmm.
two, Japanese is considered to be the more complicated one, to the point to where they don't even bother to train people in those languages. They just hire native speakers if they need them, because it's too much work to actually train an English speaker to be
Mm.
fluent enough in either of those languages to serve as an interpreter.
Yeah.
So,
I've seen those studies, and I've looked at the
Yep.
log, the hours that they say are required of study for each. And
hmm
wow. Yeah.
yeah.
It's definitely something.
hmm
Yeah, it was way harder than I expected going in, but I'm still trying.
hmm
Can you tell us the difference between localization and translation?
So I love this question. You may not like my answer, but
I'm sure I will.
there is no difference. Localization is essentially a made-up word that has basically came into vogue as a buzzword, the same way that garbage sanitation, came in terms of garbage man, or, it was basically a sexy way to rename an existing job, I have done work where I'm paid as a translator. I have done work where I am paid as a localizer. They are the exact same job. There's a difference in nuance, and that localization can happen. Like, for example, the Harry Potter books are a classic example of a book that was localized from UK English to American English. So you can actually localize within the same language. But
Yeah.
it's always on a sliding scale, right? There is no such thing as translation without localization. It's just a matter of how far do you turn the knob. There is no zero. There can never be zero. There can never be what people call direct translation. This is a a
Yeah.
myth of the internet that was created by the internet and exists nowhere. This idea of direct translation. Nobody actually wants to read a direct translation. They will say they do, or but they don't, because you present them with one and they're like, "Well, that's garbage," and I'm like, "Nah."
Right. It
So
doesn't work.
it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't work. It doesn't exist. So like localization, like I think it was like, just think of it as like a knob. It matters of how much you turn it up versus not. So, but it's a part of translation, and localization is really just the ability of, like, how much do you replace terms? Do you come up with, I don't know, like, even so much as like book covers or things like that. I mean, everything must be localized to some extent.
Yeah.
But once again, they are really part of the same thing. They're aspects of the same thing, and they're not really separate. Like, at no point do I do a translation and then do I follow that up with a localization. That is not something that happens. The two are done simultaneously.
No.
Yeah, I remember seeing some example, or they said that basically localization was a little bit more all-encompassing or whatever, and you would have to not just change the meaning, but kind of change more than just the meaning to make it fit that culture. But I feel like that just happens with the word translation anyway, right? Like, you don't
absolutely.
really need the word localization.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, I mean, and this just happens with every single translation. Once again, every single one is localized, because if we were to translate, like, if you were to translate just the words, for example, then these things would not work, right? I'm trying to think of a good example of this. I usually have a couple of good examples that I could pull up, but, like, I mean, like, this is a funny example because it just happens for my wife the other day. Is my wife is on her dictionary, and she's trying to figure out how to say the word "atama ga yowai" in English, which is basically saying someone is not. I mean, they're not. It's not really stupid.
There's
It's
many
not
ways.
it's not the same thing, But if you were doing a direct translation, you would say he has a weak head, which is not. Which doesn't tell you anything in English. It doesn't tell you anything. Like, he has a weak head. Like, you could say that, and that is the direct translation. But then what we need to do in order to make that understandable is then we would have to localize it. And you localize it, whether you're using British English, like he's a complete twat is maybe like something that you would do if you're localizing it into British English, if you're localizing it into, and then depending on what your subject matter is, like if you're localizing it for an all ages book, then it might be, that guy, he's not too smart is maybe a nicer way to say it. Or, he's kind of slow, but then I'm not sure, that might not be a great way to say it. He's a moron, he's a bird brain. Like there's so many options on the table, but the one option that's not on the table is an unlocalized translation of his head is weak, because it just doesn't transmit the information. And that's what words and language exist for. They exist to transmit information. And if I use the words exactly as written, they do not transmit the information as intended.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And that's that's the thing with localization too. Like with that, like I even said with British English or American English, and then there's there's Indian English. There's so many different versions of English across the world. And when people talk about localization, they almost, or even talk about translation, they almost always default to American English as if that were the level set and the correct and proper English, which I assure you it is not. And there are many English speakers worldwide who are offended at the idea that anything outside of standard issue American English is localization, because American English is also localization. It's just choosing to use vernacular American English as opposed to using vernacular Australian English or vernacular New Zealand English or, any of the other English options across the world. But once again, the people who make that argument tend to be Atamaga Yowai. They tend to be a bit weak in the head.
Okay.
I did feel like the term localization should make it clearer to people and give a little more wiggle room for the defense of saying, like, I need to make this work for a certain locale, as opposed to translation where people might see it more simply.
Yeah.
But either way.
And now they use the new buzzword has come to replace localization called transcreation, which is another
I've never heard that one.
Oh yeah, that one's creepy.
I haven't come across that one yet.
Yeah, transcreation, which is someone which once again is exactly the same thing. The job itself does not change in the slightest, but companies, especially localization companies, are trying to sell this idea that they won't simply localize it; they'll actually create something new in the target language that will appeal to that target language group. Which I'm like, exactly what you do when you localize something. Exactly what you do when you translate.
Right.
It's really just a buzzword to upsell their service. And you see this more outside of entertainment. You see this more because that's the other thing is people think of localization as entertainment medium when really the vast amount of localization is car manuals. I mean, to be honest, things like car manuals, internet. Yeah, help pages. Like I used to work at Amazon, and we had a whole crew dedicated simply to localizing help pages. And every time a change was made to the Amazon main help page, it had to be cascaded down and localized into every single one of those languages that was supported by Amazon. I mean, that's where really most localization happens. It's not in the entertainment industry.
Yeah. As it regards to the video game industry, I remember early on the Unreal Engine, which is made by Epic Games, is one of the most popular worldwide for most developers. But they found that the support wasn't as strong in the Japanese language. And so Japanese developers weren't using it as much. And luckily that has changed now.
Yeah.
They seem to have given them the proper support through localization or
and
transcreation.
And transcreation.
Transcreation does not sound good. I like localization more than transcreation personally.
Sure. And I don't really, I honestly, once again, like I said, I don't honestly personally care because, once again, the check cashes the same no matter what title you want to give me. And I've cashed a check in every single one of those titles and it is all cashed the exact same. So I have noticed definitely that localization is more appealing to people. Like when I do panels at conventions, if I used to I would do translation panels and not get that many people to show up, but when I say I do localization panels, more people come. So I think it's definitely the more appealing word, like you guys like, just sounds better,
Right. And legends of localization can have their alliteration, so
right, exactly.
At least they have that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what your process is, because you've mentioned that you work primarily in comics,
Yep.
and you have worked in one video
I
game.
did one video
And
game. I primarily work in comics because I'm just
no,
a comic guy. I mean, that's what I love, and that's
yeah,
what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in comics. I did do one video game because I just felt like I should. I felt like I should
hmm,
try it.
yeah,
I thought it might open up new work for me, and there was a time where I realized that most of the localization work is going to be in the future in video games because there's just more
hmm,
video games being localized, and so it seemed like
yeah,
an opportunity. But once I did a video game, I did Captain Tsubasa, and oh, I
hmm.
just hated it. I hated the whole experience. It was
So
terrible.
So
It
this
was
is really interesting, because you're
mm,
very happy with comics. Could you tell
mm,
us about the process that you go
sure.
with comics that you're comfortable with?
Yep.
And then let's compare that with the video game process
Yeah,
that you
absolutely.
experienced.
So when I translate a comic, and it is a very personal experience when I translate a
Hmm.
comic. Like I will read the comic, and then basically what I do is I read it, and then I internalize it, and inside my head I think about like I feel the emotions I'm feeling when I'm reading these things because I just love them and I just get so like I get emotionally involved in them, and then I try to think how can I make someone feel this emotion in English, right? How do I
Hmm.
and so it's like it's this very like I said it's very personal thing. It's basically like me and the comic artist are in the room is how I feel. There's the two of us in the room, and I am
Hmm.
feeling the emotions they wanted to project, and then I have to figure out how do I get someone else to feel these emotions that they intended. And that's all really I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is make an English reader feel how the Japanese author wanted them to feel when they read these parts.
Hmm.
And you get involved in the story, you start to care about the characters. It's just this really emotional, involved process, and it's also just me, right? It's just me
Hmm.
and the artist from page one till the end of the book. And so I get to do with this work, and I get to create something that I think is wonderful, and it's a great process, and I enjoy it very,
Hmm.
very much. Video games, on the other hand, I got
Okay.
you work with a software called and there's no software involved. It's literally just me, a book, and a Word doc. That's all I do. I just pop open a Word doc,
Okay.
read, type, read, type, read, type. That's all I
So
do.
are you like numbering the bubbles or
Yeah, I mean, there
anything?
every like a lot of companies have different templates they want you to
Hmm.
use, and you just use whatever template they want, and that's
Okay.
fine. I have my preferred template that I put to some other people, which is nice. I mean, part of the problem is like some of them want you to like use like character names and all this stuff to show who's saying what phrase, and I find that a
Hmm.
little bit annoying because it's basically you're typing all these extra words that you're not getting paid for. If you have to type, like Mike says, "Welcome to the
Ah,
show." Andrew responds, it's a nice sunny day, so I just simply start at the top of the page, and then I tend to do it so my preferred method is to start at the top of the page and then pick out a panel, and then you just number those throughout. So it'd be like panel 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and so those are the three things spoken in there, and then
okay.
number page, panel 2, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, piece
Hmm.
P3, 1 point, 3.1, and so I just go through and number it. Saves me the most
All
time.
right.
I don't have to type a bunch of extra stuff. But a lot of places don't like that.
Mm.
Some of them I convinced to use it, and it's very handy. But anyways, with video games, you use this.
Yeah.
At least the stuff I did, use this software program called MemoQ, and
Hmm.
MemoQ. For people that use it and are really software people, I'm not. I'm just not a tech person. I'm not a tech person at all, and so I easily
Hmm.
get confused by technology and software. And they're like, oh, because it has like these things called translation memory, and it'll remember how you translated phrases before or how other people have, and so it's supposed to have a lot of capacity built in there. But the problem is that a video game has so many lines. You're not
Hmm.
telling a coherent story. You're getting like they'll assign you a set of and you're working with multiple translators. You're working with a
Hmm.
whole team, and you'll just like, okay, Zach, your assignment for this week is lines, 1,554 through 2,066, and so it's just completely out of context. I have no idea what these
Oh,
these
okay.
dialogue is. I just have dialogue and I'm translating it, and I'm hoping that it fits into the grand scheme of everything. And also, you're not even translating straight dialogue because each question or something like each speech has so many different options depending on what you select, right? Like
Hmm.
Captain Tsubasa, would you like to play soccer? And then you have to translate like, no thanks, not today. Sure, I would.
Hmm.
How about later? And then depending on which of those the person selects, then all of those have branches they go down, right? So you're translating
Yeah.
all of this branches of stuff, but it's all out of context, and it just feels like grind work.
So
There's
did they send you anything? Videos of the game in
no,
action?
no,
The
not
original
absolutely
Japanese
nothing.
version?
Literally just a memo queue file, and then thousands. And then you're just assigned X number of lines, and you're assigned X number of lines, and you're assigned a deadline, and that's literally it. So it's up to you to like go to wikis and things, and that's pretty true. Like that's one thing universally with localization that people misunderstand is they think that you get a lot of support, right? They think that like when you're translating something, I don't know, like I'm just trying to think of some of the more famous stuff I've translated. Like, when I translated like Devilman, for example, they just assume that like Go Nagai sends you this preferred vocabulary list and blah 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 and all. You get nothing. You get absolutely nothing. Not a
You mean Go
damn
Nagai
thing.
didn't read it in all those different languages it's been translated?
I mean, but not even that. But they don't. Yeah, they don't have like a preferred naming conventions or any of this. You get zilch. You get a PDF of the book, and that is 100% it. Or like when I was doing Captain Tsubasa, I got a memo queue file with line, and then they weren't consecutive lines either. I might do line 508 through 609, and then 910 through 750, or I don't know, whatever it is. You just get assigned lines, and so you just go in there and you're just grinding out translation lines and hoping that you'll have a good editor who will be able to stitch it all together later. But it's just a much less personal experience to me.
Was it
Which is why I
Devilman in the
prefer comics so
70s?
much.
The first run of Devilman in the 70s?
The ones that I did? No, I did
Yeah.
the most recent series from Seven Seas.
He
got,
reaches right back on the shelf there.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
Nice.
I had to get this. Is like I think the original run. Of the first volume.
Well, and let me tell you, Devilman, it's hard to figure out what the original run is because Go Nagai is a lot like George Lucas, and that he goes back in and fiddles with shit all the time, right? He's like,
yeah.
And that's the other thing, like people talk about that too, is like, when they're like, oh, why didn't you do this version of Devilman? It's like as if that were my choice, as if they tend to realize how little power localizers have, when it comes to stuff like this. We're literally just we're hired guns, we have no power to do anything or affect anything.
It's
I think
very
you mean
surprising.
transcreationists, Zach.
Yes, right.
It's very surprising that they would have you work on localization for any artistic medium without giving you some access to the art. It's
a
little rough.
It is. But then I have friends that work at Nintendo, and obviously it's a very different thing when you're being hired by the company. When you're a
It's
full-time
all
employee.
in-house.
Yeah, it's all in-house.
Yeah.
They're playing the game. They're getting to do all this stuff. So that's a very different experience. So when you're a freelance translator, translators, and maybe some others have had different experiences. I know because I just did the one game. That was my one experience, and it was miserable. And that was enough for me to be like, nope, I am going back to comic book land.
Do you feel like if it had been Final Fantasy or some sort of RPG, real narrative driven like a comic book, do you think you would have liked that gaming translation experience more?
I think if it had been like if I was sort of a lead translator or something, and I was able to do it from start to finish, like the whole game, I think I would enjoy it more. Especially Final Fantasy because I adore the Final Fantasy series. But you're also, and I think but that would also that's not economically viable for a single translator to translate the immense amount of dialogue required in those games. It's just not, I don't think a company could deal with that. It's not economically viable. They have
So you want to do the whole thing yourself. That's part of the issue with gaming translation?
Yeah.
Well, that sounds like a very disconnected process that you were stuck with there. That's really unfortunate, not only for you, but for the game company, the gamers who receive it on the end.
Well,
so I did try that game, but the issue for me wasn't anything to do with localization. The issue for me was that the game it felt like it was trying so much to be like the anime experience where I'd play and somebody would pass the ball, I'd intercept, and it would all of a sudden go to like a cut scene. And it's like, wow, but wait, I don't know where I am in relation to the goal right now. So for me, that was the real issue with the game rather than anything else.
Well, and I think the way that is done is not any it's just a different process because the person who stitches it all together is the editor. There is a person
So
whose
that's
job
the person who's got the airship lifting up.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
can see the whole.
And they don't necessarily expect. And I know this also, like Nintendo does the same process. Like Nintendo has two different jobs. They have a writer and translators. And so the translators submit their translation to the writer, and it's the writer's job to basically create a new thing, right?
Yeah.
And that's why, and I think that's the same way with a lot of video games. Is the translator is expected at most to do an initial pass because they're working from such disconnected lines, and so they do an initial pass, and then it's really up to the writers or the editors to smooth it all out and make it a seamless experience.
Yeah.
So, and I don't think it's a disjointed one. I mean, I play video games and they all come out really well. They're all really, for the most part, they're super smooth. And that's because they have this process. But the translator in that process is just one of the wheels in the machine, that turns. Whereas in manga, you are, I mean, not wholly responsible because you have editors, obviously, and some of those editors do a more heavy touch and some do a more lighter touch, and that really depends also on the company and a few other different factors. But you're more likely to be the sole voice of that comic versus of that story versus video games where I would say maybe video games is more of a chorus that needs to sing together in harmony, whereas manga is more of a duet and it's just you and the artist. And I personally prefer the duet rather than being a part of the chorus.
Okay.
And I know other
cool.
people that are different. I know other people that, and obviously people that
That's
much
fair.
enjoy being part of the chorus and don't necessarily want to do the duet. They like it that way.
Yeah. Well, it's a very curious thing because, for both for both of us, Andrew and I, are really, our path to Japan was primarily guided by a love of video gaming. So to try and examine what the state is of video game localization even today, and see that in some cases it's not so great, is disappointing. Because
Sometimes
there's nothing I love more than video games, really.
Well,
it's better than it was in the 90s.
Yeah, it is much better than it was in the 90s.
SNK was notorious in the 90s with terrible translation.
Yeah.
Well, I think they just had a few guys on staff with a dictionary.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
I actually miss those days whenever they had charming, bad translations by Takeshi in The Office that had the best English scores in high school, but never talked to a foreigner in his whole life. I made up that scenario, but I'm sure that's what happened.
Oh yeah.
Possibly our first big meme. All your base.
Yeah, I know. That's what I was gonna say. And that's also funny because all of localization has what I call the localization boogeyman. And it's kind of funny that they're the boogeymen because they're trotted out by people who literally weren't even born when these localizations choices came up. All your base are belong to us is one of them. Probably the most notorious is the jelly donuts from Pokemon, which everyone knows, and they trot it out all the time. And I'm like, that was literally 30 years ago now. You weren't born. You never watched that episode air. Why are you still quoting something from 30 years ago as proof that modern localization is not good? And that's the other thing is a lot of people, especially in video games, is that they'll blame the translators or the localizers when really they had nothing to do with it. They did their job and it was passed off. And it would be editors or someone much higher up that ultimately made these kind of calls that get called. Localizers themselves almost never have the authority to make those kind of drastic, sweeping changes that people blame on the localizers.
Yeah.
It would just be impossible. They would try to make that change, and an editor would just be like, "That's not going to happen, punk."
And some of that has to do with just the difficulty, right? Of again the differences between the two languages. I mean, for example, like a general example, like sometimes you'll see a Japanese sentence and then the English translation of that sentence. The English translation will literally have none of the words from the Japanese side.
Yeah, which is
none, 0%.
Yeah.
And still be the best translation that there is.
Yeah.
Right.
And in fact, even better, because if all you're doing is translating the words, then you're not being a very good translator. You should be translating the emotional intent, not the words. And so you use the words you need to deliver that same emotional intent. And like I said, if all you're doing is translating words, you're probably a first-year translator. You're not very good at your job, and you're still learning your job. And those are the ones who, of course, get on social media and complain see something like that. They're like, oh, well, these words were used, but the English translation uses not a single one of those words. So thus it is wrong. Whereas someone else who has experience with both languages will say, oh, my God, that was a brilliant translation because it delivered the intent in a way that simply swapping out the words never could have.
Yeah. It's like you got to feel like if that Japanese person did speak English natively, what would they say, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the goal of a good localization, a good translation, is to deliver you something that feels like it was written originally in that language, right? If you play a video game or you read a manga or you watch any anime or anything, if it feels like a translation, if it feels clunky or awkward, then the translator or the whole localization team, then they did a bad job. Right? It should be smooth and it should feel 100% as if it were written in English, as if Japan was not involved at all in this game. And if you can do that, then that is a good localization. And there's people who dispute that, and they're wrong, and that's all there is to it. You don't want to, And I know people that have said this, like, well, I feel, and because this is one thing, like one of my editors, Carl Horn, often says, and he's absolutely right, is that no Japanese person is ever playing a video game saying like, oh my God, this feels so Japanese. Oh, I can't believe how Japanese this game feels. Oh my God, it's so Japanese, or reads a manga and they're like, oh wow, how Japanese this is. I'm learning so much about Japanese culture from reading Naruto. Like that is not an experience that a native reader of or engager of that entertainment media would ever have. And so if you're watching it and you're like, oh, this feels so Japanese, then that means that you're not getting the intended experience, because the intended experience was not to wow you with its Japaneseness.
That's a good point. I like that.
Right.
That's awesome.
And I think that really hits on the complaints from a lot of folks. They really want to engage with this media because they really are interested in and want to engage with Japan. But I think
and that's the thing, I tell people this too all the time, is like, if you want to learn more about Japanese or Japan, awesome. There are a million ways to do it. There's a lot of good stuff out there to learn and study, and I highly explore that. Let entertainment media be your gateway. But just don't, let it be your first step. But some people make it their only step. They make this one step and then they think they've learned something. And that's like all of us who went to Japan. I think one of the biggest culture shocks of going to Japan is finding out, and this makes perfect sense when I think about it, but at the time it was a big culture shock, was finding out how little it has anything to do with things like anime and things like manga. And you watch these things, like you think what Japan is like. You think, oh, I know this. I know the senpai. I know ramen. I know natto. I know all of these things. And then you get to Japan, it's nothing like that. And it literally, it's like, imagine watching, a Japanese person just simply watching Friends for 3 years and thinking that they know exactly what American life is like. They know exactly what it's like because they have watched Friends,
I've had Japanese people tell me,
where is your giant apartment?
They moved to Koreatown, Los Angeles, and they're like, where are the American diners? It's like, you moved to the wrong spot. Your experience is going to be a little off here. Not that Koreatown is bad. Koreatown is great, but it's just funny that kind of thing. Yeah, for sure.
I mean, I'd certainly say that the history of American entertainment media is not necessarily representative of American life.
No. And
not everybody is otaku in Japan either. That's another culture shock people probably have a lot. It's like, this Takeshi just likes tennis, man. He doesn't watch anime at all.
What textbook are we referencing here? What was that? Sunshine?
Sunshine. Yeah. It was always Takeshi, but you know what I mean? I think that especially if you're an American otaku, many people might think that it seems like a large majority of the Japanese population are also otaku, which is not the case at all. They're a fully fledged society. They've got all kinds of people. I mean, mostly one race, but still all kinds of personalities. Everything's fleshed out.
And in addition to that, most of the entertainment that is consumed in the West, or that we do over here, it's mostly the stuff for children. I mean, the stuff
Right.
that gets translated is the stuff for children, and that shocked the hell out of me because I went to Japan. Like when I went there, once in 2001, and I was huge into stuff like Neon Genesis Evangelion. Like I just loved that series. And I get there and I tried to like sort of like bond, because I'm an ALT, and I'm like, I'm going to bond with my high school students over our shared love and anime and manga because of course they must. And I was like, oh yeah, I really love, Evangelion. And they were like, oh yeah, my little brother loves that. It was a TV show for kids. It was for, it's like, that was a show that like 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds super got into. But if you were like, 15 or 16 and still watching Evangelion, that would be like one of us, like, oh, I'm 15 and 16. It's like, what I'm super into, Rainbow Bright, or I'm super into He-Man, or, just like stuff that was not, well, actually, there probably are people who are super into
I was gonna
those,
say, I think you got a lot of that actually.
Yeah, I think we got
But
a lot of that. But the stuff is that the stuff that is translated over is mostly the stuff that's targeted at children.
Yeah, younger audience for sure.
Yeah. And the reason is because I think, there's a couple different reasons, but it has much less Japanese culture in it. And so it makes for a much more universal experience. It's easier, it's less complex, it's not as culturally bound as the stuff that's intended for adults, because you try to bring something over like Sazae-san, and no one in America wants to watch that. They don't want to actually watch Japanese stuff where they would learn Japanese culture, because it's not, it's too complex, and the ideas and the situations would be so alien to them. And so those kind of things rarely are successful in the United States in translation, whereas children's entertainment, it's much easier because it's simpler. It uses simpler broad stroke concepts. And those are more translatable.
Yeah. It's a funny little aside to that is I'm pretty sure I read that Neon Genesis was a replacement in the time slot for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in Japan.
Oh yeah, same.
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
yeah, same audience. Yeah, and nobody had ever heard of Cowboy Bebop. Like I tried my best, and like I never met a single Japanese person that ever even heard of Cowboy Bebop. I mean,
That became very big outside of Japan. It's one of those cases, right? Like Ninja Scroll also was big in the late 90s in America, I think, but no one's ever heard of it. Well, not many people.
Oh yeah, and we're seeing
one of those things.
I think like nowadays we're seeing much more parody of what's popular, but even then, not really. Like if you look at like once again like the big hits, like something like Demon Slayer, that will have parody because it's an action story, and so it crosses boundaries fairly easily, right? But some of the other stuff, that's really popular in Japan doesn't even get translated because we, publishers and studios know that no one will engage with it here because it's too
there's a different kind of barrier.
Yeah, different kind of barrier. Yeah.
To play devil's advocate for a second, though, I think Evangelion is a lot deeper than Ninja Turtles, though. There's all kinds of
themes. I'm just saying that in terms of the audience that they targeted.
Yeah.
Sure, but you also have to understand that that's one of the differences in, that is also, it's a stereotype, but it's also true, is that, the America tends to think children can't grasp deep ideas, and so we tend to feed our children child's entertainment as really fluff. When Japan doesn't have that same idea, so they will put stuff in for children to watch that would horrify parents over here. Themes of sexuality, extreme violence, blah blah blah. A lot of that stuff goes to is considered to be children's entertainment. So it's not, like when I grew up, I watched, one of the first things that attracted me to Japanese animation, specifically the show Star Blazers, which was of my generation, was because it dealt with so many different themes in a way that like bland 30-minute toy commercial American cartoons never could. And so I found this stuff and I'm like, oh my God, this is, and it spoke to me so much more as a 7-year-old, as an 8-year-old, as a 9-year-old. 7, 8, 9-year-olds can handle that level of drama and thought, but American advertisers don't think so. So we feed our children Ninja Turtles, and Japan does not. I mean, they do also do that. They still have their goofy, fun stuff, but then they'll also have this other fairly dense material. And so when we encounter that in America, we think, oh, this must be for someone older because it has dense themes. And it's not. It's still intended for 8 and 9-year-olds. It's just that Japan thinks that 8 and 9-year-olds, and they're 100% correct, still want to engage with denser themes.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, and and it's not that people are older don't enjoy it, but it's just once again that is the target audience of those shows. And you can see that in like in the different magazines that they first come in. Whether they come out in Shonen Jump or they come out in one of the older ones. Yeah. And that, I mean, that was true. That was true of almost every, and there's also obviously stuff that is more popular, lots of stuff that's more popular West than in Japan. I remember when I first got hired by Dark Horse to translate Satoshi Kon's work, I was just over the moon, and I just was so thrilled. And I came home, and at that time, my wife was here. She was having a dinner party with a bunch of friends, so my house was filled with like 15 Japanese people. And I came in, I'm like, oh, I just got hired to translate Satoshi Kon, and their universal response was, who? Never heard of him. Never heard of Satoshi Kon in their life. Started spitting out some movies. They're like, nope, sorry. Haven't seen that one. Nope, sorry, never heard of it. Never heard it before. Because Satoshi Kon is much more popular in the West than he ever was in Japan.
I saw something similar to that in reverse. I mean, obviously, David Lynch was well known in America. He won awards for Blue Velvet and all. But in my high school years, I could never really find anything from him. Video stores didn't have it. You started getting Blockbuster, and it was like, here's the family-friendly stuff that's readily available. It wasn't until I went to Japan that I was able to get my hands on a lot of stuff and be like, oh, I got to see Eraserhead finally. You know? And I couldn't believe it. And the Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me DVD, not DVD, Laserdisc.
Yeah.
You had that?
Like the deleted scenes and stuff. So I was trying to track that down, but I never had a Laserdisc player. It was just interesting to see how differently David Lynch was received, and that I was able to get all his films easily at the local video store. Same for John Waters. Whose movies I enjoyed and I could never get a hold of.
Lynch was apparently pretty big in Japan, and I've heard that it even influenced the Zelda Game Boy game, Link's Awakening, because they try to put in a little bit of dreamscape into Zelda or something, because it came out that it was popular in Japan right when they were making that game. So he has fans over there,
and that makes I mean, the whole stereotype of big in Japan, I mean, exists for a reason, because there's bands that are, bands or stuff. There's entertainment that's hugely popular in Japan that didn't really connect over here, but it connects culturally with that culture, just like there's stuff that connects culturally with the West that didn't really connect in Japan that well.
Prison Break, for some reason, way bigger in Japan.
Oh, Prison Break was massive in Japan. I thought like my wife and I watched Prison Break breathlessly, and so I just assumed it was this major hit in the United States, and I only found out later that it really wasn't the phenomenon I thought it was.
No, it didn't hit quite as big, but I like those differences. It's interesting to see what takes off and what doesn't, and what's the same also.
I mean, and in an entertainment industry, I mean, in a way, it's frustrating, because there's certainly media that I would love to bring over, and I'll talk to editors and I'll pitch some series, and they just, the editors have to be the ones that make the realistic decision, because they're the ones who are actually have money to spend. They have something to lose. I don't have anything to lose other than excitement, and so they just have to be realistic about what will be sold, And I remember like one of my series that I really wanted, I was so excited about it. And once again, an editor, Carl Horn, he looks at me, he's like, Zach, if we published that, we would sell exactly 2 copies, and one of them would be to you.
Is what I like too niche?
And and I don't know, like, I'm not sure if niche is the right word or what it is, but like there's a series right now that I am just I'm just reading it every day, and I just love it, and I think it's the greatest thing ever. And it even had a Netflix show called Midnight Diner that was a fairly respectable hit here. And the comic is just
I really like that show.
The comic is just extraordinary, and I pitched the comic to multiple series, multiple companies to try and translate Midnight Diner, and just nobody sees it as something that would have sales traction, mostly because the art is too it doesn't look like manga. And that's the thing too. It's like we've so in the West we like when manga first started getting over, people seem to imprint really hard on like Dragon Ball and Sailor Moon. And that's what we consider to be manga. Anything that falls out of that just has a hard time selling because it doesn't look like manga. And the art in Midnight Diner, I think it's extraordinary. I love it, but it does not. It doesn't look like if you ask someone, say, describe me the 8 characteristics of manga, it would have none of them except for maybe the fact that it's in black and white. But so it's a hard sell, and it's unfortunate because it's a masterpiece, and it should be in English, and it should be in everyone's hands. But
I do also feel that Midnight Diner is more along the lines of something like Sazae-san.
Oh, absolutely. It's very culturally bound. Yeah.
And they know where, I mean, it makes sense. If you go, well, this is sort of in the before times when I was going into stores regularly, but if I hit up Barnes and Noble or whatever it may be, and I go into that aisle where all the manga are, it was all teenagers.
Oh yeah.
All
absolutely.
teenagers sitting around. So it's like, are teenagers very likely to buy Midnight Diner?
No.
Not so much if they're holding on to whatever else it may be, a Demon Slayer and such.
And
What's
that's
the name in Japanese for Midnight Diner?
Shinya Shokuro.
Okay.
And that's that's one of the things where when I was working with Drawn and Quarterly that I really enjoyed building that relationship, but it took a while to build that relationship. And one of the things that I did with them when we were doing Showa History of Japan is they originally were going to call it Showa, a manga history of Japan. And I was, I argued successfully eventually. I was like, we can't put the word manga on there because it will instantly, ghettoize the series. And I don't know if that's it's kind of not a pleasant term to use. So probably not that, but
it'll limit it.
Yeah, it'll instantly it'll limit it. It'll place it on a certain shelf in the bookshelf in the bookstore where it shouldn't be, because Showa History of Japan should be on the history shelf, not the manga shelf. And I ultimately won my argument because I was like, well, look at Mouse. Mouse is not called Mouse, a comic history of World War II, right?
Right.
The fact that it's a comic is not the important part of it. And so as soon as you stamp the word comic on there, people will then think of it as one thing. And I felt like Showa History of Japan, as soon as you put manga on there, some people would never touch it because they're like, oh, I don't read manga, and then some people would read manga and they're like, well, this doesn't look like manga, so the best thing to do was just eliminate the word manga, and I think you would have to do that with something like Midnight Diner as well, is not sell it to, and that's also scary for companies. It's like, don't look at manga readers as your audience, look at readers as your audience.
Right, and that's that's the you spend time living in Japan and you get to see that there's a little something for everyone, and that's really nice. And
and Japan honestly is fantastic at translating. Like someone once said that there's, I forget what the exact phrase, but it was something like, there's no more literate shelves in the world than in Japan because they have everything in translation. Like the literature of the world from Germany, France, England, it is all there on Japanese bookshelves in translation. And they just have a massive hunger for literature and comics and although they don't read American comics that much, I have to say, but for works of literature, they certainly do. It's all in translation in Japanese. But conversely, we have a very limited window of what we consider to be sellable, localized stuff.
Yeah.
And considering the output that Japan puts out, we get such a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of that. We get maybe 1% of the manga that they've ever published. And I'm sure the same is true of video games. And we even get less of their movies. Very, very few Japanese movies or TV series make an impression over here.
Yeah, it's definitely rare. As I'm not very high level. I would say I'm pretty solidly intermediate in my Japanese language skills. I passed Ed3, which doesn't, which is nice, but it also still doesn't count for anything really. So in looking for TV shows and stuff, it was a really rough struggle until Netflix came along with their Netflix originals that had subtitles in like 20 languages, and I was like, oh, wait, let me check this. And when I saw that they had Japanese subs on Japanese shows, I was like, what a helpful learning resource this is. Where was this 20 years ago?
Oh, yeah.
Man, it's
Netflix,
insane, yeah.
Netflix was a game changer. I know someone who works in localizing those shows. I think she works for Disney now, but they were. I was just talking to her about how they were like how Netflix basically, and they don't get nearly enough credit for it, but they basically were the game changer on that. They were just like, because all of those companies had subtitles in all these languages and all their local services, but Netflix was the first one that's like, why don't we just stick them all on every service?
It's so nice.
Great.
Especially too as a
Yeah.
language teacher, I would always tell my students, like, you tell your parents, my teacher told me that I should get Netflix. And I say, if your parents would like to hear from me directly, that's fine. I'll call the house, I'll call their phones, whatever, and I will tell them this is one of the best resources you can have. Is art that your child loves, that they will engage with, and it has accurate subtitles.
Yep. And it was unfortunate that Netflix didn't market that better. I think that they could have done a lot better. Like even they could have rebranded themselves as like Netflix International and like but they didn't really. And now Netflix is of course tanking. But I still love
Which
it.
is crazy because they've still got a ton of subscribers.
Oh, they're still magnificent.
They lost 250,000 subscribers. It'd be like, wait a second, you got 250,000 subscribers to lose. It's okay. You're gonna be all right.
But you're right. That's a great way to learn to study, and that was one of the good things about being in Japan is that, and I don't know if all of the leaders know this, but when you're in Japan, almost all TV shows are actually subtitled in Japanese.
Yes.
Because because Japanese has so many homophones, meaning words that sound the same but change meaning depending on which kanji you read. So almost all shows just have and as a learner, that was such a great experience because you could turn on any Japanese show, and even if they were speaking too fast, it was all subtitled down there in Japanese, and it's a brilliant thing to learn, way to learn.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
I think as a learner, like there's definitely, getting back to one of our earlier talks about language, there's definitely a bridge between textbook Japanese and natural Japanese that you have to cross, and it's not an easy bridge to cross. And it is actually, like I was talking about in Seven Samurai, it's that moment where you start thinking in Japanese. You're no longer thinking in English, translating the sentences to Japanese, and then spitting them out, and then getting input in Japanese, retranslating that into English and sending that to your brain, when actually the whole machinery is going in Japanese. The brain is Japanese, the voice is Japanese, and the ears are Japanese. And when I had a multilingual aunt, and she would often tell me that the first time, the way she knew that she actually learned a language is when she started to dream in that language. So I remember the first time I had a dream in Japanese, it was so wonderful because I realized that now not only my conscious, but my subconscious brain actually was able to speak the language. And that's when I knew I had crossed that bridge. I was no longer memorizing phrases. I was actually producing original content in Japanese.
Do you think were you objective towards your own subjective experience while trying to get Japanese? Or were you just like study? You know what I mean? Like how rote was it, and how? Because again, I don't think you'll mind me saying this, but Tim Rogers would tell me, he said that, you kind of have to pay attention to how you think while you're studying, especially something as different as Japanese. And you have to, I don't know, be objective towards the machinations of your brain almost.
Let me address that just a little bit as an educator. So this is metacognition. This is thinking about your thinking. And as someone who is learning a language, you should start to develop a metalinguistic awareness. Almost any multilingual person, as soon as the second language is introduced, there can start to become this awareness, and it should happen. Not everybody follows up on it. Not everybody pursues. But yes, you should be thinking about how you're thinking and thinking about those differences and thinking about how you're learning. That is definitely important. Not everybody's going to recognize that it's happening, but it will happen.
I will say, and I will say that I don't recall being really aware of that. My version of learning Japanese was, I did my master's degree in Japanese, so there was traditional studying, but the vast majority of my studying I did at a local bar. So this is another thing that I recommend.
Way, right?
Yeah, well, because I tell people that a lot. It's like one of the things to do in Japan is find a bar Um,
Yeah.
go there because Japanese people will be a lot less self-conscious when they're in a bar situation and when they're drinking, and go to
Mm-hmm.
that same bar every day, become a regular. And then you
Mm-hmm.
go there and eventually they stop seeing you as a Japanese person and start seeing you as a person. Or I mean, stop seeing
Mm-hmm.
you as a foreign person,
Right.
just start seeing you as a person. And you can just go there. Like I would just go there and try out some things, and I would just like try out, and like I would get a little bit of conversation, and I would mimic it, and I would try to internalize it. But I did one of the things that I learned when I got up to that level is that to speak Japanese, I had to
Mm-hmm.
change my personality. I had to literally become a different
Mm.
person. Like I am a different person in Japanese than I am in English, and you
Mm-hmm.
have to be because of the way that because Japanese is a high context language versus English, which is a low context language, and so English is a
Yeah.
low context language. You say all the words you want to, right? Japanese being a high context language means that a lot of the conversation takes place in context. And I use like one of my examples I use from this is like I could say come home from work and my wife would look at me and she would just say one word. She would say the word dish. And that's all she would say. And from that word, I would know that I had breakfast this morning. I would know that I left my dish out on the
Mm-hmm.
table, and I would know that I needed to go and wash it and put it away. And it's not to be rude, but it's because that's the nature of a high context language.
Mm-hmm.
You don't say all the words that you need that are built into the context. You just use the words you need. Versus
Mm-hmm.
in English, where we use way more words than we ever need, right? We say everything.
Mm-hmm.
We're like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, when you went out this morning, you left the dish, the purple dish, the blue dish, and there's crumbs all over the place, and some of them fell off the table, and the dogs had run, blah, 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 blah. We just want to use
Yeah.
so much words, whereas Japanese is just like, they're concise. So they may like, you can have entire conversations that are simply flinging single words back at each other.
One of
Um,
Mm-hmm.
my favorite
yeah.
examples of this is a cultural thing is if it, let's say somebody's in the hospital in Japan
Hmm.
and you ask, how are you doing? And then they'll respond, thank you for asking.
Hmm.
And like, that'll be it. There's no long explanation
Hmm.
of how they've been doing,
Hmm.
how many IV drips they've had. I just feel like I've had family members that I know they're in pain and they're in the hospital and stuff, but
Hmm.
like, this is like me being Larry David, I guess, but I just don't need the whole explanation, the whole rundown of everything you've been through. I
Hmm.
love the Japanese version. Thank you for asking. And that's
Hmm.
it.
Well, and Japanese is much more comfortable with set phrases and with like sort of like
Yeah.
ritualized language that comes off as
Mm-hmm.
insincere. But at the same time, they can, I once heard someone say that Japanese people don't have sarcasm, and it just cracked me up because I'm like, you have never in your life met a Japanese person then, because
Mm-hmm.
they
Yeah.
can use those ritualized phrases to devastating effect. I mean, just
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
devastating. Um, like,
Sugoi
yeah.
can be very sarcastic.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yep.
Yeah.
Sequoia could be amazingly sarcastic. Arigato could be a knife to the heart. I mean, there's just because all of that is just built into this context, and this idea that Japanese people have they call this the relationship. That and I don't know if you guys have heard this, but it's supposed to be like when you get conversationally enough with a person, when you have enough of the context and the sync with them, they're like Japanese people don't necessarily need to use words. They'll just say ah, and you would go, and we would understand exactly what we needed to talk about. And my wife would get frustrated with me and still does because she's like, why do I have to use so many words to get you to understand? Why can't we have an relationship, as she says? And I'm just like, and she'll do that to me sometimes. Well, I'll just talk to her and she'll just throw a word at me. And I'm like, honey, I'm American. You've got to use more words than that. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And as a translator, once again, that's another thing you have to deal with because Japanese people, they're also really happy with repetition. Like repetition of phraseologies is totally fine in Japanese, but we read that or hear it in English, and
Yeah.
it sounds awful. It sounds stupid. If the three of us were to say like, I'm fine, thank you, and you, I'm fine, thank you, and you, it would just sound ridiculous. In a
Yeah.
thing that is not meant to sound ridiculous, and so a translator, by doing direct translation, can introduce comedy in something that is not meant to be comedic, and that's something that you have to watch out for as well.
Yeah.
I love it. Mike, did you want to go into Wayward a little bit more deeply before we move on?
Yeah, let's just get a couple of
Yeah.
questions here. So how did you get connected? Jim Zub is the writer there.
Hmm.
I'm trying to remember the artist's name. I
Steve
can.
Cummings.
Okay.
Yes. So I got introduced. I was actually really funny because I got introduced. And this is one of the fun things about comics. I found that working in the world of comics, almost everyone in comics is fairly gregarious and friendly and more
Hmm.
than happy. We're all super happy to see each other succeed. And some people are like, "Oh, it's this competition." And it's like the opposite of a competition. Like when I first got into
Hmm.
comics, it was crazy how many people were like, "Oh, did you want to get comics? Well, here, let me give you a hand up. Let me introduce you to this person. Blah 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 blah." And so, I met this guy named Brandon Seffert, and he did a comic called Witch Doctor, and I thought his comic
Hmm.
was brilliant. And so I told him once at the convention, and bam, we became friends and went out for drinks, exchanged email, blah blah blah. And then Jim Zub was someone I didn't know at all, and he was creating this comic, Wayward. He was looking for a few different people to sort of serve as experts. His idea was that he would bring
Hmm.
in a different expert every single issue, and that every single issue would have a
Hmm.
different person writing these backup essays. And so he asked Brandon, or like however the grapevine ended up, Brandon ended
Hmm.
up doing the introduction between me and Jim. And I knew that Jim had done this funny uh, D&D comic called Skull Kicker. So I knew that he had
Hmm.
done this comedic comic called Skull Kicker. So like Jim's like, and then eventually Jim sends me an email. He's like, "Oh, I'm thinking of doing this. What do you think?" And I was just like, I thought it was going to be awful, and I sent him like a one line reply is like, "Sure, I'll take a look at it." And then I got the script, and the script was just brilliant, and it was so perfect, and it was great, and I just like my response back after getting the script was just like this effusive, like it's like, "Hey, thanks for sending this over. By
Yeah.
the way, I am now your permanent essayist. You will not go with your original plan of having a bunch of different people doing this. I will do every single one. I'm also now a part of the series, and go
Yeah.
ahead and put my name on the cover as well." And I just basically hired myself on to do it.
Uh,
And Jim is now just one of my best friends. I play Dungeons and
mm,
Dragons with him every single Wednesday. So
yeah.
we have an ongoing in Ravenloft right now, ongoing campaign that's lasted a couple of years. And
Nice.
yeah, he was
That's
up at
awesome.
yeah, we just met and clicked and put it out, and it was great. And I'm really proud
Uh,
of the work that we all did on Wayward. I think Wayward is just a
yeah.
phenomenal comic, and really does. I mean, like, as Steve, who lives over in Japan, he managed to capture, and that was one of the things that we really want to do with Wayward, was actually tell the story of not only the story we wanted to tell, but set it in real Japan versus
Hmm.
Fantasyland Japan. That most Western comics that use Japan, they use what I call Japan as decoration, whereas they
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
they want, yeah, you know, they
Hmm.
want throw a few lines out there. They want their main character to, to whip out a few things of Japanese and, throw like
Yeah.
some sushi in the background or something like that
Right.
to give it that exotic
Yeah.
feel.
Right, right,
No,
right.
in this case, it was clearly very integral to the story.
Oh yeah,
It's-
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and it wound
And I was
brilliantly.
very surprised and happy with the shift for a little while to the Irish folklore there, because
Oh
that
yeah,
was a lot of new stuff for me, and I
yep.
really enjoyed that too.
Yeah, and that was great. I mean, that was one of the things when you're working on a comic, you never know how long you'll get to work on it. Like we had a plan to escape after 6 issues. We're like, if this completely fails, then we'll end it at 6 issues. We'll have the one trade, and it was a good gamble. And and
Hmm.
so sending her to Ireland was always part of the plan, but we never thought we'd get there. So when we finally got to Ireland, it was like everyone was like, "Woo, we survived!"
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, spoilers, folks.
Yeah, I mean it's a very old comic by now, so and people are still enjoying it, which is great. I think that
Hmm.
at conventions now, I'll still have people that are trying out Wayward for the first time, and I think it does a remarkable job. And I'm really proud of the essays that I did in there as well. Like at
Yeah.
first Jim would have an idea, but then at the end I was just like, send me the script. I'm going to tell you what I feel like writing about, and it allowed me to write about a lot of aspects of Japanese society. Like I think one of the ones that was I think that freaked people out the most, maybe, or we got the most mail and feedback on, was my SSA on the police system in Japan,
Hmm.
and that surprised a lot of people. And I'm like, yeah, Japan is a very nice country until it's not, and
Yeah.
you do not ever want to run afoul of the Japanese criminal law
Yeah.
system ever. They will just put you in
Yep.
jail forever and not worry about it. It's fine.
Yeah. It's-
You know.
yeah, there's a reason they've been on that amnesty list for a little while. Hey.
Oh yeah, yeah. Due
Yeah.
process, human rights. Nope, 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 nope.
Yeah.
Those are not things that they're gonna happen. You're just gonna be slammed in jail and put there forever, and
There's
maybe
always a
executed randomly, and then they won't tell you that you tell anyone. Like me, I remember my wife was over here, and they saw like one of the prisoners, God, whoever did the Oklahoma City bombing. I can't remember his name. Timothy McVeigh. They were
Hmm.
announcing his execution. She's like, "Well, when was he executed?" I'm like literally just now. And she was just like so
Hmm.
freaked out about that because in Japan they won't announce executions until several years later. They will be like, "Oh, and then breaking news, Timothy
Oh,
McVeigh was
that I didn't
executed.
know.
Yeah, back in December 15th, 1997 or something like that." But they
well, I
certainly
think
don't.
Shoko Asahara was announced, but they didn't. It was like we're doing it today. It was
Mhm.
announced like the day of or something.
Oh, did they?
Like
Okay.
people had thought it was coming up. That's the
Yeah.
most recent one. That was the guy that
Mhm.
had the sarin gas
Yeah, and
stuff in the
he's
90s.
kind of, yeah, and that's pretty rare. I mean, like I said, they generally just will do it after the fact. They won't actually like,
Hmm.
yeah, and they'll all or they'll tell you that he was executed. They won't say like, all right, we're gonna do it. They'll be like, oh, he was executed this morning or something like that. Not
Hmm.
the day that
Okay.
there's no like anticipation up to the moment for people to get their popcorn and wait
They
for the
won't
moment.
they won't even tell the guy himself. I think the Shoko
Yeah.
Asahara just didn't know
Yep.
when the day was going to happen.
That's
I mean,
that's part
that's
of the Wayward article. Like you
Man.
just sit
Yeah.
there and just one of the mornings they'll wake you up and they're like, "Hey, how's it going, Mike? Oh, here's some breakfast. Oh, by the way, come with me." And that's your day.
Yeah.
You'll
hmm
never know until the day it happens.
I just wanted to ask, why are there no Simpsons and He-Man conventions in Japan, but America has countless anime conventions?
Yeah. I mean, that's such a great question, and it's an interesting one, and it's one that I actually talk about a lot of time because I'll be, like, so just to give you my own personal history, and I find this fascinating, because it just shows how weird the world is. My grandfather was literally at Pearl Harbor. He was a member of the Coast Guard. He was at
Hmm.
Pearl Harbor when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And then a scant 2 generations later, his grandson is going to these conventions celebrating Japanese culture, speaks Japanese. His whole job is just like, I imagine just going back in time one day and just like seeing my granddad the day after Pearl Harbor. It's like, I'm your grandson from the future. What do you do for a living? I I help spread the joy of Japanese culture throughout the United States. I mean, in a way, it's weird, but at the same time, it's fantastically awesome
Hmm.
that the world has done that. But it is only really Japan that has managed to do that culturally. You don't see people holding Swiss culture conventions or even although it's getting more popular, like Korean culture conventions and things like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
think that part of the thing is that Japan, from the 60s on was very aggressive at selling what it called, what it now calls, it didn't have a term at the time, but selling its soft power. You
Mm-hmm.
had people like Tezuka who was producing Mighty Atom, and then he was, they were exporting those cartoons to the United States. And so that's another thing where people talk about like anime and manga as a recent phenomenon. And I always laugh at that because there's never really been a time, at least from the 60s onward, that anime has not had a presence on American television. They were watching Astro Boy, they were watching Gigantor, and
Hmm.
Japan was just really aggressive in marketing its culture as a product and
Hmm.
highly successful. Can't think of any other country that has ever been that successful as marketing its culture as a product. And they have been selling their culture to the world for generations now,
Hmm.
and I think it's that has been the subliminal thing. Like you're playing, from the 70s onward when video games really take off. Japan's selling you Pac-Man, and that's the other thing that's interesting is because they're not necessarily trying to sell you an authentic Japanese cultural experience. If they were, they wouldn't have made a Italian plumber as the main character of their most popular series ever. I mean, really, they
Yeah,
weren't
that's
trying to
true.
sell this authentic
Hmm.
Japanese experience. They were just trying to sell product. And in selling product, they also had a lot of Japanese people that would then go out around the world to help as salesmen. And I've heard a lot of like stuff about this with like Japanese salesmen down in like South Africa. Like Nintendo would put people down there, and then they wanted to, the people that live down there, they're like, well, we want to eat Japanese food, So then Nintendo would actually fly down sushi chefs and people like things like that. They would see a little opportunity, and then like that would be the first time for someone in that area to come eat Japanese food for the first time. And so it was this like spread of culture as a sellable artifact that I think really Japan pioneered. And has led to this just like, and people talk about it, obviously we're here and I'm American, this is what we're talking about, but like France, for example, is actually the world's largest consumer of Japanese entertainment. France reads far more manga than we do, and in America, there's far more series translated into French than there are translated into English. Sadly, I wish we had France's manga market, because France also reads all the stuff that Americans won't. Like they read all the complicated adult stuff instead of just all the stuff for children. And I honestly, I think that's why. I think that just from the economic miracle of the 80s and the Japan's seeing culture as an actual sellable product and working very hard to sell that product, and just seeing this sort of like universal adaptation of that product. My wife, for example, she's a professional chef, and she works at the restaurant of this sushi chef called Sushi Kashiba, who's one of the great, he actually has been, decorated by the Emperor of Japan for spreading culture and all this other stuff. He was a disciple of the famous Jiro Dreams of Sushi fame.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and he purposefully came to Seattle back in like the 70s to introduce sushi here, because he knew that there was a Japanese population, and so he was the first person to sell sushi on the West Coast and bring it over as an exportable product. And Japan also is really amazing at this concept that's basically called transmedia. I think that, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with it, but it is I don't know of any country on earth that is better at it than Japan, which is the idea that when you sell one thing, you can sell everything connected to that one thing all at the same time. Like when Marvel puts out a movie, Marvel doesn't also try to sell you the Marvel comic. They consider that entirely separate things. They don't care. If you, as long as you're, but Japan will like, here's the anime, and here's the video game, and here's the comic, and here's the, it's all connected and it's all supported by this ecosystem environment.
This was a conversation people had in the 90s, I remember, when they said, in Japan, people buy video game soundtracks. And I was like, what? As a, as a kid in the 90s, like, that's a thing? I really want that. Yeah. Because that was not a thing at the time. And hardly a thing now, really, I guess, because everyone sells CDs. But
now with Spotify and things like that, it's there.
But Japan, in Japan are masters of transmedia, and they've been working at it longer and harder than almost anyone else. And so you hook people like in multiple angles. You bring them in multiple different ways, And there's even more now, because now there's cosplay layered on top of that people get into. And whatever door they choose to enter through, the Japanese system is built to upsell you on other products in the same way the American system is not. Once again, a movie that debuted in Japan, I'm sure you guys encountered that when they would have like the road show, they would have little kiosks there that were selling you all these other things, selling all these little products. You were never like these single entertainment, you never were expected to just have the one. Like if you liked Godzilla, okay, that's great. I'm glad you enjoyed the movie, but you also need the T-shirt, and you need the comic, and they all support each other, and they all work in concert with each other in a way that American entertainment just does not. Our stuff is so disconnected and so isolated, and once again, it always has been. And just like the split between naturalism and expressionism, like we talked about earlier, that split has always existed, at least as far as I know. Like in the United States, even when we think of what maybe was the first film franchise, I would say the James Bond films, right? This was an establishment of a film franchise, but there has never been an attempt to sell the James Bond books through the James Bond films.
Right.
No one has ever come up at the end, at the end of a James Bond film and had a library of available James Bond paperbacks there for you to pick up. We just don't care, because they're usually owned by different companies, for one thing. They're different licenses, they're different media, and the people selling you the movie, they have no interest on if you buy the books or not, because it does not make them any money. They're not interconnected and linked together.
It just feels like in America there's a need for this otaku subculture. it's a very well defined subculture, but there is no, like there's no He-Man conventions in Japan. There's no Simpsons conventions.
I mean,
people watch Friends to learn English. That's about it. Like there's no parallel. There's, like you said earlier in the podcast, no one's really buying Marvel comics, even though the movies there are more popular than ever, I guess, just because they're popular worldwide. There's no parallel. There's no parallel there.
Yeah, and that's, and I wouldn't say, once again, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's only otaku culture, because like my niece and nephew read manga, and they couldn't care less about otaku culture, at all. They just get everyone at school reads a manga. It's the most common thing on earth, and that's what I love. I love the fact that manga has this, I think in the U.S. manga has long escaped otaku culture, because you can engage with it in multiple different ways. Like they're just kids reading paperback comics. And they couldn't care less about Japan, and they couldn't care less about fandom, and they couldn't care less about any of this stuff. All they do is they like Naruto and they like One Piece, and that is entirely where their interest in manga begins and ends. And they even know that their uncle is a manga translator. They don't care; it doesn't mean anything to them. They just I like reading One Piece, and then when they're done, they just pass it off to a friend, and that's fine, And in Japan, that you do have, you do have American comic conventions. The Tokyo Comic Convention is one of the major conventions in Japan, where they bring American artists in, and they do this whole thing over there. So that does exist, but it exists about the level that Japanese anime fandom existed back in, say, the 1980s, when a convention probably was held in a single room at a community college. And people pass tapes around and things like that. So it exists in Japan, but just, at that level.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah, it's just something I've noticed. It was just like, it's just not the same. Like Anime Con is coming soon to LA very soon. And it's like, there's nothing like that in Japan. No, there's no opposite. I'd like to see like the opposite thing, but it just doesn't exist. It doesn't have to exist, but I noticed the difference. That's all.
And it doesn't exist because America has never really made a concentrated effort to sell its culture as a product. We sell, like the same way Japan has. Japan has done that like on a governmental scale, like with the Cool Japan initiative and things like that. When Japan saw its manufacturing start to die down, when no one was buying computers or cars from Japan anymore, the government was like, well, then what is our industry? And that's also something that Japan historically has been really great about, is reinventing itself, just changing its culture. There was the Japan that existed, and then Japan met China, and China was so much culturally advanced than Japan ever was. And in 5-10 years, Japan just made this giant cultural leap and just absorbed everything in from China and changed. And Japan has done that multiple times, multiple times in the history of the country. It's one of the really unique and interesting aspects that I think of Japan, is that it is able to absorb outside influence and rapidly adjust in a way. And that's how they've kept being prominent in the way that so many other Asian countries have not, is because they can do this. They can meet someone superior to them and just instantly like, oh, you're better than we are. Boop, boop. And then they just level up, It's crazy. And Japan did that, when their industry was dying and they weren't selling the stuff anymore. And then the Japanese government was like, well, what do we do? We lost all this industry. This is what made us all the money. And they're like, well, what do people like? They're like, they sure do like them comic books. And like, all right, then we will now put all of our effort into selling Japan as a culture. And then that will bring in, not only sell this, but that'll bring in tourist dollars. That's what the JET program is all about. The JET program, as it was initiated, and the sole reason that the JET program ever existed in the first place, is because someone told the Japanese government that it would be a good idea to bring college-educated, what they called it at the time, the future leaders of America, bring them over to Japan for a year, teach them how awesome Japan is, get them to love everything about Japan, then send them home, and then in the future they will be predisposed to like Japan, and they will give us better trade deals, and they will bring in over more Japanese stuff. The whole point of the JET program was to seed people who love Japan over in their home countries, and so that they would buy more Japanese stuff.
They're playing the long game there, man. That's crazy.
It is the long game, and it was also
super effective.
Super effective because, hey, here we are.
Look at us.
How many
Yeah.
translators were standing ready and available when that wave of manga influence hit? And also,
Yeah.
we brought it over. Like we did the same thing. We came back from Japan and we're like, yeah, I want to know where I can get good sushi. And so now there's sushi restaurants. And yeah, it was a highly successful plan that Japan did. I think this has been great, you guys. I gotta pop out, but had a great time.
Yeah. No, thank you so
and-
much. We really appreciate
Yep.
it. It's
Thank
Really
you all
appreciate
so
it.
much.
Thank you. That was Zack Davisson, everybody. I'm glad you guys stuck around and listened to the whole thing. Really enjoyed having him on. Thank you again, Zack. That was awesome. Really I love doing like the deep dive into Japanese culture and localization and all that, and how all these things intersect, and getting to talk about soft power at the end and all that. First heard that term from Matt Alt as well, actually.
I think that might be where I heard it too. I'm
Yeah.
not sure, or it might have just been. Well, who knows? It's been so many years
Yeah.
now.
Forget at this point, but yeah, I feel like it's again a reason why we had the idea for starting this podcast is to kind of go over this niche stuff, and I think it'll find its audience. So again, thank you, Zack. And if you like listening to this, please subscribe to us on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Music or all the above. That would be great. We also have a Patreon. It's at patreon.com/gaminggaiden. And our main our main goals for this is that Mike wants a Mister.
Yeah, we're
So-
gonna start small here. I would really
Yeah, we're
like a
starting
Mister,
small.
a little FPGA. That would be really fun to play with. I have a CRT that I haven't really been able to use, so I think a Mister would be great with its accurate timings and all that.
Yeah, this is our goal for season 1. If we could just get a Patreon goal to where we can just buy this stuff without dipping into our own budget, that would be great. If you could support our noble cause. And my goal is for years I've been wanting a Neo Geo CDZ, and I want the cartridge as well. But but anyway, the thing is, Neo Geo emulates perfectly, generally speaking, and it's an expensive console, especially after the pandemic. It's gotten even more expensive. So again, these are kind of ultimately frivolous things, but if you want to donate, that's where the money's gonna go. Just being honest with you, we're
Once you get
gamers.
past that, I could put it towards groceries because
Yeah. Exactly. So, and we can maybe use that as part of a YouTube content or something like that. Us for season 2, us, doing a stream with the Mister and with the Neo Geo CDZ, something like that. So yeah, huge SNK fan. Been all my life. Love Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter as well. Love fighting games. Mike does as well.
Oh, yeah.
So that's the reason for that. And that is it for me. I'll see you guys later.
All right, same from me, and look forward to our next one. Thanks.